Hello again, Year 8, and welcome to the Khan Academy's next Year 8 history lesson. This is going to be about the Battle of the Somme in 1916. So first of all, you should have completed a starter activity as part of your team's live introduction with your teacher. Now we're going to make a start on today's lesson, and please don't forget to pause the video when I ask you to, because you will need to do that to complete the tasks. And don't forget that your teacher is available on Teams should you need to ask any questions at all. Let's get started. First of all, I'd like you to write down today's title, which is Why is the Somme known as the bloodiest battle in British history? Now you should know that in today's lesson we are going to be looking at the battle in some detail. We're going to be looking at what actually happened, as well as studying things like the losses, but also what was gained for the Allies as part of this battle. We're also going to be considering in this lesson whether this battle should be remembered as a success, or whether it should just be remembered as a bloody battle. So let's get started on looking at the content for today. Okay, so now you've got down today's title, I'd like you to write a subheading, please, as background information. We're going to start off today's lesson by looking at what the situation was just before the Battle of the Somme. So it's important we start by talking about the years 1914 to 1915 and what was kind of going on at this stage. Now, between 1914 and 1915, there was basically a muddy stalemate in terms of trench warfare. Now, what that means is that neither side, neither the Allies nor the Germans, could really attack effectively. Instead, it ended up becoming defence, defence, defence. And actually, nobody's going to win if it's going to look like that. Somebody needs to kind of form some sort of battle plan that will allow them to attack. Now, the Allies developed like a new plan, which they called the Big Push, and this was on the Western Front where the Allies met the Germans. Now, basically, this would kind of coincide with other battles that were coming from the Russians and the Italians elsewhere. Now, the British originally wanted to attack in Belgium, but the French demanded an operation at the point where the Allied line was, where the two armies basically met. Now, this was along a 25-mile front near the River Somme in northern France. I'm just going to show you on the map here, that's where the Somme River is. We're looking around about this stage here, where basically the two armies would meet, the British and the French. On the 21st of February 1916, the Germans attempted to wear down the French army and attacked at Verdun. So basically, you can see just here on the map, this is where the Germans decided to attack the French. And of course, you know, at this stage, that would have been quite a surprise, and actually the Germans were winning. In July 1916, the French army actually was close to collapse at this point, so it was really, really important that that didn't happen, because if it did, the Allies could have been defeated. Now, there was a high casualty rate in the Battle of Verdun, and many troops were actually starting to refuse to fight because of these casualties. Now, the Germans were about to attack again, and if they did, then the French army would be defeated and the Allies would lose the wars. This was really serious. Now, General Hague was basically ordered to divert the Germans away from Verdun. Now, if you've not heard of General Hague before, he's a British general, okay? So he's been put in charge of kind of diverting the Germans away from Verdun by basically leading them up towards the Somme. Basically, by launching an attack there, it would divert some of the German attention that way, and then basically it would relieve some of the French soldiers in Verdun. And obviously, this was important in terms of keeping the Allies in the war. So this is telling us a little bit about why the Battle of Somme happened and what was happening just before it. I also just want to mention to you guys, the Battle of Somme took place from the 1st of July until the 18th of November 1916. It wasn't a single battle. We're going to look at what this looked like in practice over the next few slides. But before I move on, could I just ask that you make a few notes, please, about the background information, so that you've got something down in your books about why the Battle of Somme happened. Make sure that you particularly mention the Battle of Verdun and why it was necessary for the British to intervene at this stage. You might want to pause the video here while you make a few notes. For our first activity, I would like us to read an account from a soldier who actually fought in the Battle of the Somme to help us learn a bit more about what it was like. Whilst I'm reading this out loud, I'd like you to make sure that you're bullet pointing some key things that you understand from this account to tell you what the battle was like. Just pick out some key things that are quite descriptive, and what does this kind of account tell you about what was happening during the battle as well. So listen carefully as I read through and write some bullet points into your books or on your piece of paper about what the battle was like. Let's get started. Went over the top. After an endless period of terrible apprehension, which is like anxiety and worry, our artillery seemed to increase in intensity, and the German guns opened up to no man's land. Noise was deafening, fumes choking, and visibility limited owing to the dust and clouds caused by exploding shells. It was an absolute firestorm. I was momentarily expecting to be blown to pieces. My platoon, which was like a group of soldiers, continued to advance in good order without many casualties and had reached halfway to the German line. Suddenly, an appalling rifle and machine gun fire opened against us and my men commenced to fall. I shouted down, but most of these that were still not hit had already taken cover. I dropped in a shell hole and occasionally attempted to move to my right and left, but bullets were forming an impenetrable barrage, and exposure of my head meant certain death. None of our men were visible, but in all directions came pitiful groans and cries of pain. This was from the 1st of July 1916, the very first day of the Battle of the Somme. So after listening to that account out loud, could you now stop this video and make some bullet points in your books or on your paper? What does this account tell us about what the battle was like? Now, in order for you to find out more about the Battle of the Somme, I'm going to ask you to complete some comprehension tasks, which will allow you to find out more about the battle, but also make some really good notes in your books as well. Now, ultimately, when you're answering the comprehension questions, it is really, really important that you do write in full sentences. Because if you don't do that, your answers won't make sense when you read them back later on. And at some point over the next few lessons, you will perhaps want to go back to these notes as you continue with your other pieces of work. It's really helpful if you write in full sentences. And that way, even if you read it next year, it would still make sense to you. So, for example, with question 1 for this first comprehension task, I'm asking what was Hague's plan. You would need to write Hague's plan was, and then you describe what Hague's plan was. The second task is to make a list, so that's not as necessary because you can just make bullet point notes for that one, okay? But the other comprehension tasks on the next few slides will also require full sentences. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do, guys, is read the information just in this box here. And then once you've read that information, I'd like you to answer the 2 questions in this box. As I said, one is asking you about what Hague's plan was. The second task is more of a list. You just need to bullet point the different reasons for why the Battle of the Somme did not go to plan at the beginning. Read this information carefully and answer the questions. I would recommend that you pause the video now so that you can do that. This next slide is basically your comprehension continued. There are 9 questions in total, so you now need to have a go at answering questions 3, 4 and 5, which are all about the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Now, you've just been reading about the events that occurred just before the first day and what the British and the Allies attempted to do to try and make sure that the battle was successful for them. But what you're now going to look at is what actually happened on the first day. And there are 3 questions, as I say, that you need to answer using this information. So you're looking at what position were the Germans in on the first day? Like, were they in a strong position? Were they in a weak position? Did the initial actions of the Allies actually work? Question 4, you're looking at the consequences for the failed bombardment at the beginning. Now, just to remind you guys, the bombardment is the constant bombing that the British and the Allies did just before the battle started. So that's what you're looking at on the slide previous. The 5th question is asking you how successful was the first day for the Allies. You'll need to read the information to make a judgment about that and explain why. So pause this video now so you can read the information carefully and answer the next 3 questions. Now, this is the final slide of your comprehension task. Again, you're going to need to make sure that you're answering these questions in full sentences. You've got questions 6 to 9 now. And again, you're going to need to make sure that you read the information above the questions to help you answer those questions correctly. You also need to make sure that you're writing in full sentences. So the questions are, what happened on the 14th of July? So you'll need to find out and describe what happened on that day. How many battles were part of the Somme offensive in total? How much land did the Allies gain from the Battle of the Somme? And how many casualties were there from each of the different armies? Now, I'd like you to pause the video in a second to answer these questions, but I also just want to let you know that if you're struggling with answering these questions, if you go to the end of the video at the end of the lesson, you will find the answers to these questions. And that way, you can check to make sure that you've got the right things down. So if there is one particular question that you're struggling with, don't worry, leave it blank for now, and then come back to it at the end of the lesson when I go through the answers. If you're really confident with your answers, you can just leave the bit at the end. You don't have to continue watching the answers if you don't want to. It's only if you feel like you need it. Okay guys, pause the video now to get on with this part of the task. Now that you've done your comprehension task, looking at what the plan was for the Allies in the Battle of Somme and also what happened in reality, I'd now like you to identify why the reality was actually so different to the plan. Now in this picture here, this shows you the plan that the Allies had for the Battle of Somme. This picture here shows you what happened in reality. All you've got to do is identify how the plan is different to the reality and kind of look at what went wrong. So let's have a look at one example together. So in the plan, you can see here that German trenches are destroyed. Now remember that there was the week-long bombardment from the British and the Allies, where basically they were just bombing German trenches for 7 days. Now they hoped that that would mean that the German trenches and machine gun posts would be destroyed. In reality, if you check out over here, you can see that the trenches were of course damaged, but many troops survived. And this was because many of them were in deep dugouts. Now, of course, this meant that in reality, when the British troops wanted to cross no man's land, they wouldn't be able to do so easily because the German soldiers had survived. Whereas in the plan, they had hoped that most soldiers would have been killed, and they hoped therefore that the British would be able to easily cross no man's land and get to the German trenches. What I'd like you now to do is just stop this video and identify the rest of the differences between the plan and the reality for the Battle of the Somme. And you might want to just jot down as bullet points the things that are different. Your final independent activity today is to make a judgment about the following question. Do you think that the Battle of the Somme should be remembered as a victory or a bloody battle? You've got to make your judgment using all of the information from today's lesson. I want you to consider how much was gained and how much was lost, and then make your judgment explaining your answer. But before you get started, there's a few things I'd like you to consider and a few things I think is worth mentioning before you decide which side you're on. Let's start by first of all considering how much was gained. Now we know that the Allies gained 7 miles of land. It doesn't seem like a lot, certainly not for the amount of lives that were lost. Let's think about some of the other things that kind of came from the Battle of the Somme that could make it be considered a victory. For example, there was after this a more professional and effective army that seemed to emerge from this battle. Also, tactics for battles basically developed from here as well, including the use of tanks, which kind of emerged from this battle and this period too. And actually some of these new tactics were the foundation of some of the Allied successes in 1918. So we could see that as a real positive. We also could think about the fact that actually the Somme was successful in relieving the pressure of the French at Verdun. So it had technically fulfilled its objective, had done what it set out to do in that sense. But of course we have to think about how much was lost. In total, over 1 million men were killed in such a short space of time. And actually, in some cases quite unnecessarily. The tactics being used in this battle were outdated, and you're going to be looking at that in a lot more detail next lesson. But it's important we think about the fact that some of these lives could have been saved had they used different tactics earlier on. We've also got to think about the huge losses for communities. In 1916, this was the time of which PALS battalions had signed up to fight in the war. And the PALS battalions that were part of the Somme, in many cases, suffered huge losses. And this meant that many British communities were plunged into grief. And that, of course, is devastating. So what you've got to think about is, should the Battle of the Somme be remembered as a victory? Something that, although there were sacrifices made, do you think that overall it should be considered as a win? Or do you think, actually, the victory it wasn't strong enough, and instead this should be just remembered as a bloody battle? Think about everything we've talked about just now and in today's lesson. Pause this video and write your paragraph. If you would like to find out the answers for the comprehension task earlier today, you should keep watching the video. But if you're not interested in that because you think you're confident in your comprehension questions and answers, then of course you can stop the video now. Thank you very much for listening, Year 8, and take care. Okay, so let's quickly go through the comprehension questions 1 and 2. Question 1 is, what was Hague's plan? Now that one's quite straightforward, it's right at the beginning. Hague's plan was for the 4th Army to break through in the centre while the 3rd Army in the north and the French 6th Army go to the south to make divisionary attacks. The reserve army, including cavalry, would then exploit this gap and roll up the German line. That's basically Hague's plan. Now, for task 2, we kind of need to write down just a bullet-pointed list about why the battle did not go as planned. So first of all, it's important we talk about the fact that the Germans, of course, were stationed behind formidable defences. Now, what that means is that the Germans were better protected than the Allies understood from their intelligence that they'd carried out. And so what that means is they didn't know that the Germans would be as well protected from the bombardment as they were. Now, also we know that the British carried out a 7-day bombardment of the German trenches, and they hoped that this would completely destroy German offences, it would destroy their guns, it would put down the barbed wire, and it would just make it really easy for the British troops to advance into the German trenches. Actually, they overestimated their firepower, and that's another reason for why it didn't go to plan. The guns were spread too thinly, but also, when the British fired their 1.5 million shells, some of their shells were actually defective. In fact, 30% is believed were actually defective, so it wasn't going very well in that sense. You could also think about the fact that many of these bombs were shrapnel bombs that basically would throw out steel balls. These were basically not really effective against dugouts, so they would obviously kill troops in the open, but they didn't work against concrete dugouts, and so they didn't really, kill the soldiers that they were expected to kill. You could also add the point about the fact that the German defences were not actually destroyed, and in many places, wire remained uncut. So basically, a lot of the things that they expected to destroy were not destroyed. You could also maybe write down as well that one bomb was detonated 10 minutes before the attack was set to start. Now that's a real problem, because then it meant that the Germans knew an attack was coming, so they could get ready for it. So there's a number of different reasons as to why the battle did not go as planned at the beginning. Make sure you've got something along those lines for those 2 questions. Okay, so let's now go through questions 3, 4 and 5. Question 3 is, what position were the Germans in on the first day? It's important we understand that obviously the Germans, of course, had a bit of an advantage from what we've just described on the previous slide, but also the British were actually struggling to keep up with their bombardment, and what that meant is that basically the Germans had a little bit more time to basically prepare. So where it says here, in most cases they were unable to keep up with the barrage that was supposed to take them through to the German trenches, this gave the Germans time to scramble out of their dugouts, man their trenches and open fire. So what that tells us is the position the Germans were in on the first day was actually quite beneficial to them. They kind of knew a bit about what was happening because they'd heard that first exploded bomb, but also, from the bombardment, I suppose they kind of knew what was going on at that point, and they knew that they needed to prepare for the first day of the battle. Now, obviously, it's important we then talk about number 4. What were the consequences of the failed bombardment? Well, the consequences were essentially partly that the Germans were ready. The fact is the Germans were ready and were therefore able to get their machine guns, their rifles, their artillery in place. And so you needed to have mentioned something for question 4 about that. So you might want to just kind of highlight this section here about the fact that they were met with a storm of machine gun fire and artillery fire, and actually they suffered over 57,000 casualties during that first day. Can I just mention, guys, 20,000 men actually died that day. That's casualties, which includes deaths and injuries. Now, in terms of obviously looking at question 5, how successful was the first day for the Allies? I think we can probably agree that the first day was not a huge success. It does talk about there being some local successes, and the French have made good progress. I would say overall, the attack was actually quite a bloody failure. Now, what that means is that it was a failure, but also lots of people were injured or killed on the first day, which I would argue is not really very successful. So hopefully you've got something again for those questions. Okay, so let's quickly go through the final 4 questions then. So first of all, question 6, what happened on the 14th of July? 4 British divisions made a dawn attack at the Longueval Ridge. Hopefully you got something down about that. And the fact that it was supported by an intense artillery bombardment which caught the Germans by surprise, and by mid-morning they had captured the ridge. So what this tells us, on the 14th of July, the British were successful in capturing the ridge, and also this is partly due to the fact that they were able to catch the Germans by surprise. I suppose it's a bit of a turning point then for the British. Question 7, how many battles were part of the Somme offensive? It's 12 separate battles in total. Question 8, how much land had the Allies gained? It's 7 miles or 12 kilometres in total. Doesn't seem like a lot, does it? Question 9, how many casualties were there? The British Empire suffered 420,000 casualties. By the way, casualties are deaths and wounded, just make it clear. The French is 200,000 casualties, and the German losses were 450,000 casualties as well. That's killed and wounded. So make sure that you've got all 3 of those figures down for question 9. And that concludes us going through the answers, year 8. So I hope you managed to get a lot of those right, and hopefully those that you were struggling with, you managed to go over the answers and answer correctly now. Thank you very much again for listening, year 8, and take care.